going to open the floor to questions now. When you ask a question, it would be really helpful if you could tell us your name and where you come from if you represent an organisation. We have a roving microphone. I'll take 4 questions at a time. We've got a roving microphone? Okay, it's coming. And I'm actually going to, if I can have a show of hands, I'm probably going to start at that end, because it seems to me that that end of the room always gets slightly excluded from the questions. They're a little bit far away from the table. A question from the gentleman at the back.
I'm David Piershaw from London School of Economics. If one went back 80 years and discussion of public works as a response to poverty and unemployment, then I think there would have been a lot of reference from Keynesians to multiplier effects, but I've heard almost nothing about that today. I mean, is this just a form of workfare that you're talking about, which just is a bit more attractive to governments or to donors, or is it, I know it's only been piloted, but is it potentially something that could have a big effect through multiplier effects and a big impact on jobless growth, which Stefan Durkheim said it's nothing to do with it. I don't quite understand why he said that, because if it were on a big scale, it would surely have something to do with that.
Thank you. And a second one just here from Mito.
Yeah, Kimiyaki Jin. I was chief rep of JICA in the Japan International Corporation in the UK, but as of 1st of March, I transferred to JICA Ethiopia office. So I'll be involved in this productive safety net program in Ethiopia soon. Regarding the public works, my understanding there are lots of different, at least public works is a multidimensional activity that also contribute to the infrastructure development for the economic growth, and also, well, of course, the social protection as you discussed today, but also balancing the gap between the rural and the urban, especially regarding the growth rate and also the wealth of people. So there are lots of functions if we can properly manage those public works. But in my feeling that today's discussion is more or less or heavily focused on the social protection side, but less focused on the effectiveness of public works itself and also the asset produced by the work. And the improvement of, somebody already mentioned that the improvement of this asset is also quite important technical aspect to improve the livelihood of the people in the developing countries. So there are lots of rooms, like even for the productive safety net in Ethiopia, there are lots of problems like labeled terracing or not properly sealed water harvesting pond or not properly constructed roads. But those problems can be solved with proper capacity development, which requires more technical input from the production side or people in the expert in production side rather than the social protection side argument. So I want to know about the comment on those points.
Any more questions down this end of the room? No? I think Simon. Oh, sorry, Simon over there, and then we'll come to you.
A couple of quick questions. One, there was an interesting slide showing the data source for the book from the World Bank. Obviously, it wasn't exhaustive, but it struck me that the list of data that was given didn't include anything at all about outcomes on people's livelihoods and so on. And my own experience in reviewing projects, including very many by the bank, has been that the actual outcome or impact on poverty isn't at all measured. It doesn't even feature at all as an indicator. So I had a couple of questions. One, Stephen Durkin, he said that most of the projects at the moment have been done as pilots. And I was wondering how on earth it's possible that if all these schemes have been pilots, that they haven't done the basic thing which a pilot is surely supposed to do, which is to generate some information. A question to to the two colleagues from the bank would be, I wonder, what recommendations would they be making internally in terms of the way in which the monitoring and the monitoring in particular of public works schemes would need to be revolutionized in order for us to have some kind of confidence that they are in fact doing any good. And then a question, just to be fair, a question to Anna. She thought that there was a problem of design in the way in which many of the projects were possibly not meeting their social protection objectives. I was wondering, maybe inviting her to reflect on to what extent it's a question of design and to what it's a question of the fundamental logic, and that there's some fundamental flaws perhaps in the way in which we assume that a public work, specifically both public and work, is a way of providing social protection to people.
Thank you. We'll get some responses from the panel and then we'll come back down to this end of the room. Colin, Carlo, do you want to?
Sure. Just very quickly, starting from the back, the database is not of World Bank projects. The database is of programs, country programs. And we wish we had all that information, but unfortunately we don't. One of the things we're doing to fix the problem is to try in the projects that the bank is working on to have very strict, at least monitoring, and try to promote a lot of evaluation. And this is something which I think is coming up fairly strongly from all the discussions that we're having here. In terms of the other things I like to say is that, you know, when you're talking about why is that much emphasis on social protection? From my point of view, the emphasis on social protection is because public works is one instrument. It's not the solution. It's not, you know, Stefan said it. I mean, it's not the panacea. It doesn't solve all the problems. But one thing we found out writing this book is that can achieve a lot of objectives. And if this instrument is that flexible, can achieve some instruments, maybe there is can be one of the different type of instruments can be used by social protection in order to achieve its objectives, which is to help people to storm crisis, to help people to lift them up out of poverty, and to help people to participate in the growth process. This means that this instrument has to be thought and designed within country-specific objectives, taking into account country-specific type of constraints. And, you know, I very much welcome the idea of taking into account what is the type of labor market in a certain country. So, I mean, just like coming from the outside somewhere and saying, I think public works is going to solve all the problems, ain't going to work. Take India, for example. The India program is a very big program, but it's not the only program that is in India. They had a very large food subsidy program, which now has been replaced by the cash programs. And you have, at least looking at safety net programs, you have two different kinds of instruments, at least two different kinds of instruments which are used. And within this context, I think is important. Last word I want to say is about the pilots. Yes, pilots, and more pilots. One thing we've been reflecting at the bank now about these pilot issues. So one thing that we're looking at is trying to use the money that we have for the projects to leverage government involvement. We are much less interested in delivering a program for 20,000, 40,000 beneficiaries, but much more interested in building the systems that you're going to be able to deliver benefits to, you know, 100,000 people, 200,000 people, 1 million people. That's the most important things. If we go there and try to build up something to deliver to 20, 10,000, 5,000 beneficiaries as quickly as we can and says, okay, we've been reaching that many people, which is that percentage of the population, I think we failed. We're not going to be able, never going to be able to put up the scale. But if we have the systems in place, and the system is in place, I'm talking about targeting mechanisms, I'm talking about databases, we're talking about monitoring mechanisms. If we set that in place, even if we said that even if it's going to take a year and a half, maybe 2 years to do that, that means that the money that the bank is going to provide is going to be just like a very small amount compared to what the program is going to do. And if you look at that, I think Brazil is a very good experience.
Would you you like anything that Carlo's not covered that you want to follow up on?
Carlo always covers most things, but I'll just add a few extra words. Just some reflections from the questions and the general commentary, the issue of pilots and the role of social protection. I think one thing the panel discussion misses is that a lot of our discussion is based from data going around 2010. And if you look at what the bank has supported even since 2002, we now support around 80 countries who've been looking at public works. Over half of these countries actually launched public works programs after 2009. So it's a rapidly changing area, and I think a lot of these pilots are leading up to bigger, more integrated programs, and that's where the policy dialogue is. Now, the role of safety nets within that context, or public works within that context, one of the big debates we had was the title of the book, Public Works as a Safety Net. And I think that title deliberately speaks to, public works, one of the main roles will be for temporary employment. It's not a panacea for other things. So it's this question that, the answer that Carlo raised, you have to look at the role of public works within a broader social protection system, and the complementary to other interventions too. And if you look at what's happening in Ethiopia, the combination of the PSMP and the assets building program, there is some of your early evidence showing what happens when you combine some different instruments. A few direct responses to the questions. Advice on monitoring. I think another issue we have to be aware of is that very often as donors we're following governments who are moving very, very quickly, who want to actually deliver cash and deliver assistance in a time of crisis. So getting the monitoring right from the beginning is often very difficult, but that is typically our advice. Just try to get a monitoring framework agreed from the outset and be realistic in those expectations. There's often an emphasis on get the impact evaluation done and rolled out, but before that, get the monitoring framework and get your process evaluation in order first, and then you can actually speak to the other points. And the question just on the multiplier effects and spillover benefits of public works. Yeah, I think it's something we're careful to look at. I think we described them in our book as secondary effects, the impacts of assets and social cohesion benefits, but I think they're important and they're certainly there.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've been asked to be very brief, so I'd like to answer quite a few questions very briefly, if that's all right, and hopefully the partial answers will stimulate you to read the book. Multipliers. Both books, haven't they? Multiplier effect. To have a multiplier effect, you need two things. You need to be transferring a significant amount of resources to a significant amount of people. And I would suggest that in most low-income countries, simply the net transfer is too low. It really doesn't have a stimulus effect. And it's more in middle-income countries that after the crisis that you've used public works more as a kind of demand stimulus instrument. And typically that's not their role in low-income countries. Effectiveness of assets. Yes, on one hand, if you want effective assets, you can strengthen local governance. But actually in many low-income countries, you have profound local governance capacity issues, which perhaps need to be addressed more systematically and can't necessarily be addressed on an ad hoc project support basis. That's a real challenge. I would quite agree there. Most of the indicators the donors require are process indicators. And I think till that changes, you're not going to have more analysis really looking at what the impacts of these programs are. Because as long as the donors require indicators based on process, you're not really going to get to the meat. So I think there's an interesting discussion to have there. Last point. Last point, the design and theory of change. I think actually the theory of change of many public works programs is very poor. They're known as Christmas tree programs because everybody thinks they can achieve something. We could achieve livelihoods promotion, social protection training, and in many countries they tend to get loaded with a whole set of objectives, which really tends to undermine the theory of change and often make it really quite confused. And final point, I think there's often a major disjunct behind beautiful critical thinking happening at headquarters level and what actually happens in the field. Simon and I are doing a study at the moment, and we've been astonished by the lack of understanding of the people actually implementing the program, who've understood none of the finer points of discussion which are the basis of the program as it was designed. So I think that would be my final response there. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to give you a chance to respond in the second round. Is that okay? Yes, okay. I'm going to take one question that's coming from someone listening online. So Kate Carroll from ActionAid is asking, is there any analysis of the impact on and for poor women of public works? So there's been a little bit of work on India with reference to the provision of creches and other opportunities that are appropriate for women, but there don't seem to be many examples. Could we have a reflection on that? And then any other questions? This lady, you wanted to ask a question. Can we have the mic? Then the gentleman over there. Do you want to go first?
I seem to have got the microphone, so maybe I'm the first.
Can you keep your question short? To the point, please?
Donald Curtis, one very brief comment, and that is about the administrability of public works, and which I don't think has been mentioned, but public works departments in India have an engineer, and they keep projects in the state of incompletion so that they can turn on public works. Quick comment on Multiplier. First time I came across a famine relief program in Botswana, the women were paid in grain. They turned some of the grain into beer after their fortnightly ration, and the FAO came running out to see whether they really needed it. Whereas, in fact, what they were doing is multiplying the value of their asset. But my question is, what is the boundary? We are working at the boundary between public and private here. Are there examples of actually public works programs that create private assets so that people have a sustainable livelihood? Is that a transgression?
Thank you. Can we bring the mic down here, please?
We wouldn't be having the problems you raised. I'm glad that you raised those things. We wouldn't be having them if we, the donors, the think tanks, NGOs, recipients all use a concept map. Then we wouldn't be having projects. We would be having systemic sustainable development. And there is evidence, research on the constitutions of developing countries. They tend towards authoritarianism. That very much relates to corruption, which is much more than the aid that is being received there. My point is the conflict insensitive aid in the last half a century or so has, in the case of oppressed people like us in Sri Lanka, has destroyed their socio-economic environmental fabric nearly to zero, and has caused genocide, bloodshed, the worst bloodshed of the century in 2009. And that is DFID, FCO, they all must, if we have a concept of it, all work together, we wouldn't be having this sort of thing. Thank you.
Thank you. To the gentleman at the back.
Hi, David Mattias from Save the Children. My question is about flexibility in design, and I guess I'm wondering about. It seems that a program designed for these kind of short-term covariate or seasonal shocks is going to do something very different than something longer term related to maybe a number of idiosyncratic shocks, be it in relation to targeting or complementarity with cash transfers or other things. And I'm wondering about the experience or learning of a program that's expanded from a short-term to a longer-term social protection scheme, and or vice versa, and then about flexibility in the transition between the two.
Thank you. And then a last one from the gentleman just here, and then we'll come back.
Thank you. I'm Terry Tissem from the ILO. First, I will recall that both books are dealing with social protection, social safety nets, and this means that it's presented as setting public works up as an instrument in social protection purely, and it's seen as an controversial versus cash transfers, and it's presenting in that context. And I think this is limiting our debate a little bit. First of all, I will also go into saying that I'm a bit amused by Anna's comment about typologies, as this debate, your research goes only 12 years back, so in the last millennium, I think those typologies were really at the core a lot of debates in the communities working on public works programs. Donors are supporting often projects and pilots, as was referred to, and they sometimes work themselves into government programs more and more. They become more and more long-term rather than short-term, responding to certain shocks and crises, and that's good, because what we need are integrated approaches. We need to look at not only public works as a social protection instrument, but look at it as a continuum from investments through public employment programs and through social protection schemes, and see it as a former speaker was talking about sustainable development approach, and the role of public works into that. And then we come into the issue which is really core to here. We look at what is the impact of these works. You can't look at it as an impact on one instrument only. You have to see how it works into a sustainable development approach and look at the continuum and the dynamism that in and out, scaling up and scaling down programs for different purposes with multiple different objectives, but very, very clearly defined what is expected of it for certain purposes. ILO is working particularly on developing assessment models now to do that, look at how the social protection security schemes through public employment programs and investment programs work together in that and trying to help out on that. We will welcome further collaboration and structured work on that to see that we can strengthen that such that governments and people can actually take the decision in their hand, knowing through transparent decision-making processes and dialogue, decide where are these public works programs actually efficient as a social protection scheme, but also in a larger sense. Okay? So I just wanted to mention that, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. You need to go very quickly at 2 o'clock. Is there anything that you want to respond to that's been raised, or?
Are you looking so stern that I shouldn't?
I will quickly do. It will be the other way around. I think it's interesting that several people have now commented and saying that we see more and more pilots being scaled up. I don't know, and I would like to see the evidence of that. And I think it would be really interesting to start understanding better which pilots, also quantitatively, what percentage of things that we've done have actually been scaled up, have actually been reflected. And also contrast this, because it's a really important point, I think, that I clearly had not thought about enough, is that quite a lot of schemes have been set up quite quickly during the crisis, around the food price crisis, and subsequently you have things. To what extent are they more sustainable? Are they actually being scaled up or not? And that would, I think, be quite a helpful thing looking forward, how we systematize these things. And I can't help making a very quick comment on multiplier effects, since it was referred to me as well. I think Mr. Hicks clarified Mr. Keynes very carefully by making sure we don't mix up aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And I think it's a very clear case of during crisis situations like we had with financial crisis, that boosting aggregate demand may well be a sensible policy, because it actually is a collapse of demand in crises. But for a lot of the schemes, we're operating in settings where the absolute supply constraints are there. So doing boosting aggregate demand because you want to just have these multiplier effects, they will probably not have that big effects. And I think, in fact, the evidence, and I've looked at quite a few of the papers on that, there's very limited, this kind of Keynesian multiplier effects from these schemes, even locally. There's DIFTIS funding a project looking at village level multipliers. They're small. They're not irrelevant, but simply seeing it in that kind of debate, I think it's not going to be too helpful in the way it's at least being framed here. Leave that. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just address a couple of points. On gender, there's some really interesting work. Actually, my colleague Bex Holmes has done some work looking at gender dimensions of NREGA. I'm sorry, who asked the question? I should be looking in the right direction.
Online.
I was online. Sorry, hello, online person. I mean, my colleague Bex Holmes has done some work looking specifically at NREGA. But what we see is that actually there are some quite imaginative programs which expressly address gender. Some simply say you must have somewhere lactating women can sit. I mean, that's sort of one set of gender responses, but they're not really profound gender responses. You need to think about women's labour participation, the availability of labour, household allocations of labour, thinking about flexible hours, enabling women to work together in groups. And there are a few really innovative programs which actually try to look at what the reality of poor women's lives are and incorporate that in design. So there's a few examples of that. Mostly there's quite a lot of lip service to gender issues, but it's not necessarily really meaningful in terms of program design and experience, I think. I just wanted to answer two more points. I've got 30 seconds for each. This whole 20 seconds each. The whole issue of state-citizen linkages and coordination is absolutely central, and I think the kind of public works that you have and whether it goes to scale or not depends on a government's perspective of the state-citizen relationship. What does the state think its responsibility is towards its citizens who can't find work in the open labour market? And actually it's quite interesting. If you look at where the large programs are, you don't tend to have small programs that scale up. That doesn't tend to happen. The small programs tend to begin large. NREGA went national 40 years at state level, then it went national. PSNP was delivered nationally. Many of these large programs, they were conceptualized on a national scale. If you're thinking about something local, the design implications, the implementation implications are very, very different. So actually, it doesn't tend to be a sort of continuum of something small growing. If you're thinking big, you have to think big from the start, because the kind of systems you implement would be very different. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything to add?
Just one thing that tricked me was the issue of short-term, long-term. I don't think the issue, the way I see it, is not that you have to start with one model and move on to the other one. There's nothing bad about the type of model that you use if that responds to the needs of the country. What is important, though, is that to make even a short-term program effective, you need those institutions in place which are going to be permanent. Even if you use a program every 2 years, for example, only if you have some kind of a drought or a flood or something like that. I mean, take the case of Ethiopia. I mean, it goes from a certain number of beneficiaries, and that grows. But even for a short-term program, you need the institutions which are permanent institutions, which are able to bring it up to the scale that is needed. If you have a long-term program with different kind of objectives, then it's a different kind of issue that you're trying to address.
The question is not so much about the timeline, but it's about the path dependency of something that's focused on a certain type.
Yeah, but I'm saying the path can be totally parallel and totally different. If the need in one country is poverty reduction, employment guaranteed scheme, then you're going to have a long-term program that is going to build in order to be able to do that and reach a certain percentage of the population. If you're looking at a crisis-prone country where you want to have a flexible instrument that is going to have short-term public works which are set in place only after a drought or a flood or some kind of covariant crisis, it's a completely different objective that responds to completely different needs.
Rachel, 60 seconds. Yeah. I agree with most of the comments, so I'll pick up on two questions. The question on gender. So we provide some information on our data in terms of how programs have reached gender quotas in terms of participation of women in public works programs. There's a lot of literature on NREGA programs showing how the introduction of a public works wage has helped to increase the casual wage level for female workers. But I do think that often you find in operational manuals there is a whole series of ideas on how you can promote female-friendly public works, but in practice those criteria aren't exactly delivered against. There were two questions on the administrative complexity and this issue of path dependency, and my 2 cents on that is that implementation is going to be dynamic, but public works programs are very complex, and you need to get the design right, because it's quite difficult to go back on issues of wage setting, institutional development, and to try and refine those as a program goes on, so you need to get those right at the beginning. And so that's, I think, also why our book focuses a lot on the operational side and picking up some of these implementation features. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid that we're out of time to ask any more questions. I'd just like to flag two things. One, some emerging work from ODI that looks at readiness in response to shocks. And one of the things that we've realised through that work is that assuming that you can take an existing social protection programme and build a shock response on top of it, we've been a bit too simplistic about our assumptions within that. For example, it's frequently a different caseload depending on what kind of shock you had. And I guess the same would be true of a short-term humanitarian response programme and the extent to which you can then turn that into something longer term. And then just finally to say, it's really interesting hearing the pilots thing come up again. I don't think I've seen a real pilot for a long time. For me, a real pilot is when there's a decision to go to scale and you're figuring out the best way of doing that. So you're testing different ways of delivering it at scale. The pilots that I see are either proof of concept, and in programs like this, it's proving that people won't spend their transfer on drink or drugs, or proving that people won't become lazy because of public works. And we design our proof of concept pilots to succeed. They get all sorts of technical inputs that just don't happen in scaled up programs. Or we see experiments, which frequently we're too frightened of calling experiments, so we call them pilots. And I'd really, really like to see a lot more clarity on that. So having been cheeky and given myself the final word, I'd like to thank very, very much our presenters and our discussion for a really good conversation. Please speak to them for a few minutes at the end if there's anything else that you'd like to follow up with them on. Thank you very much.